Thank you everyone for being here. All right. It's nice to have Justine with us after a long time, and it's nice to see that there is a very interesting and lively audience. I would like to introduce the speaker for those who don't know her. She is an associate professor in art history and medieval studies at the Department of Arts, College of Fine Arts at the University of New Mexico. And she has been an associate professor ever since July 2010. Now, Justine studied at Assumption College, Worcester, Massachusetts, and she got a BA summa cum laude in art history in 1993. She then studied at Southern Methodist University, Dallas, Texas, and got an MA in art history in 1995. And she got her PhD from the University of California, Los Angeles, I think it's UCLA for short, in art history in 2002. And I mean, obviously, she's written quite a few papers, and I would like to especially to cite the role of Genoa in the visual culture of Famagusta, in Famagusta Art and Architecture, edited by Andrew Weilkar, Brepols, publishers, 2017. Sorry, 2015, and the flexibility and the fusion in Eastern Mediterranean manuscript production, Oxford Bodleian, in Byzantine images and their afterlives, essays in honor of Anne-Marie Weilkar, edited by Lynn Jones in Ashgate, 2014. I should also point out that Justine Andrews is a member of the Board of Trustees at CARE, the Cyprus American Archaeological Research Institute, from 2010 to 2019. So she's had quite a varied and distinguished career, but tonight she is going to give a talk on the visual culture of Lusignan and Genoese in 14th century Cyprus, and she's going to emphasize how the 14th century in both Europe and the Mediterranean was one of upheaval, war, and plague, but also one of innovation, interaction, and opulence. Well, I think I've said enough. Justine, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Thank you all for being here. I see so many familiar names, and I'm excited to be here. I think it's been, I was telling Nicholas, it's been about 28 years since I first came to Cyprus, with a rather tumultuous introduction to the island, but a wonderful one too. I am happy to be here talking with you all. Again, some of the material I'll talk about tonight will be familiar to many of you, but I hope that I'm kind of putting it together in a new way. I want to thank the Center for Natural and Cultural Heritage and the Open University of Cyprus, as well as Frederick University and the Cyprus Research Center, and of course, Nicholas Correas for inviting me here tonight, or this afternoon for me. Okay, let me share my screen. And there, I think I am. Hope everyone can hear me and can see. If not, please shout out to his colleague in the history department, Michael Ryan. And so I've been thinking then, and also the work created under them, some work created under them, and kind of follow that century through, thinking about a few things. The 14th century in both Europe, as I think Nicholas gave this nice introduction, both Europe and Mediterranean was one of upheaval, war, and plague, but also innovation, interaction, and opulence. These contrary images make this century one of the most fascinating to explore for its production of the visual arts. The arts of architecture, sculpture, and painting find new forms in this period. Cultural forms travel to new spaces and are expressed in uniquely integrated ways. Cyprus responded to the 14th century in its own way, having already existed under a Latin crusader-inflected government for a century, and continuing to engage with the local population of the Greek Orthodox community. In this paper, rather than look closely at one or two works of art, I'd like to expand our viewpoint and consider the long 14th century, beginning a little bit into the 13th century, the late 13th century, as a period of artistic innovation in Cyprus, looking at examples of artistic production by the major ruling parties, the Lusignan, and later in the century, the Genoese. Since the end of the 12th century, the rule of Cyprus belonged to the monarchy of the Lusignan family. At the end of the 13th century, Cyprus felt the dramatic effect of the Christian loss of Acre to the Mamluks in 1291. This caused refugees from the Holy Land to stream into the port of Famagusta. This continued well into the King Hugh IV's reign, when in June 1355, James of Verona, an Augustinian monk, witnessed over 1,000 Armenian refugees disembark at the port. This influx of people required new spaces and architecture to house them, and the institutions they established, such as churches and monasteries. Because of this population boom, and perhaps because of the Lusignan kings were generous patrons, large projects, both Nicosia and Famagusta's cathedrals, took place. In very general terms, the early forms of the Latin cathedral called Santa Sophia and Nicosia are familiar to the Crusader church plans of the cathedrals of Tyre, and ornament on the lintel of the exterior door of Santa Sophia in the second decade of the 13th century, and the sculpture of the outer door of the Holy Sepulchre Church in Jerusalem, and other sculptural comparanda for the floral ornament at Santa Sophia are found in the few remains from a parish church, Great Hall at Crac de Chevalier in Syria, both from the mid-13th century. Later in the 13th century, we begin to see Santa Sophia have more architectural elements that are associated with the West and France, but continue to be mediated by the Syro-Palestinian Crusader architecture. For example, a polygonal apse is built in Santa Sophia's east end, paralleling the Church of that league, which was built again in the ribs and ribbed vaulting as the Cathedral of Nicosia. These visual ties of the Latin kingdoms in and around Jerusalem suggest that the early 13th century, the bishops of Nicosia and the kings of Cyprus were drawing a borderline between themselves and their local population. One must remember that throughout the 13th century, the leaders of Cyprus looked continually to the Levant and had substantial interaction with the Crusader states. Upon acquiring the island in 1192 in the Holy Land to settle on Cyprus, this migration of people continued, if sporadically, until the final influx of refugees arrived after Acre was lost. The Kingdom of Cyprus adopted the laws of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and the relationship between the kingdoms was solidified by the King of Cyprus's claim to the crown of Jerusalem in 1269. Cyprus was therefore intimately linked to the Holy Land through family, church, and architecture, at least through the end of the 13th century. It wasn't just the Latin monarchy and bishops who patronized the arts and architecture. Orthodox churches were painted in the Troodos Mountains, commissioned by both Orthodox and Latin parishioners. One icon dated to the very end of the 13th century is dramatic because of its unusual size at almost 6 feet tall. It was created for the Church of St. Nicholas de Staes. It includes the patrons, badly abraded, but who can be identified at least as a Western knight and family by their dress and his armor. The icon of St. Nicholas, now in the Byzantine Museum of Cyprus, is a large panel painting with the standing Satan, the Son, Christ, and the Virgin in the top corners. At the bottom of the center image, at the saint's feet, appear the donors. A man and his horse are on the left, both in Western-styled armor, and his wife and daughter on the right with long footsy gowns, and their heads covered. These figures all kneel in prayer with their hands in prayer in front of framed images of the scenes from the saint's life. St. Nicholas features prominently wearing the same blue and red robes as he does in the central image. St. Nicholas's face in the central image is frontal and modeled with careful shadows. The icon appears Byzantine in type according to the position and composition of the central frame and the inclusion of scenes from the saint's life. However, the appearance of those scenes not on all four sides, but only on two from the normal Byzantine icons is, of course, its size, again, at being about 6 feet tall. These elements relate to each other to create a modified form of a repeated type of Byzantine image. Rather than being a private image or one that is kissed as it sits on a stand in the naos of the Byzantine church, the image suggests a more prominent positioning, perhaps behind an altar or along a wall. The background continued to draw the viewer into a personal dialogue with the saint, and the inclusion of Western donors suggests that they wish their prayers to be offered in supplication to the saint and then to Christ. While the mixing here is within the visual presentation of the work of art, the elements are all outside the strict definitions of Orthodox icons, was made for an Orthodox church. The ritual and experience surrounding the image was also mixed. For many years, the Pope and his prelates had warned Latin Rite Christians not to practice or attend services in the Orthodox churches. Yet we know that at least some of the time this did occur. The image of St. Nicholas creates agree with the space of display and the use for donors. Elaborate monastic spaces were also created in the early part of the 14th century. In the hills above the port of Kyrenia is the Abbey of Belapais. Hugh IV was patron and occupant at the monastery. And I wanted to point out that the Lusignan often inserted marble lintels with 3 heraldic crests carved in relief at these monuments. The Carmelites also built a large church in Famagusta early in the 14th century as well. And finally, the Orthodox community built a large church in Famagusta during this period, dedicated to St. George. It eclipsed the small earlier Greek churches such as Agiazoni nearby, with its size and visual relationship to other large churches in the city. These are the earlier Orthodox churches. Like Santa Sofia Nicosia, the Cathedral of St. Nicholas in Famagusta was conceived as a coronation church and played an important role in the establishment of Cyprus as a new frontier for the crusading movement in the 14th century. Since 1269, the King of Cyprus had claimed a second title as the King of Jerusalem. When Acre was lost in 1291, the King of Cyprus continued to claim rulership over the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and it was imperative to find a new venue for this separate coronation. Henry II, who ruled from 1285 to 1324, and the Bishop of Famagusta worked together to create an impressive site that evoked the international character of this kingship. Hugh IV was crowned King of Cyprus in Nicosia, and 1 month later, he was the first to be given the separate title of the King of Jerusalem in a separate royal authority. This new royal authority created a desire for a stronger embrace of contemporary French Gothic idioms at St. Nicholas. The facade of the cathedral in many details evokes the powerful image of the French coronation cathedral at Reims. They're the same high gabled portals whose tympana feature quatrefoil tracery with glazing, and the jambs have deep niches for sculpture. Although only the smallest fragments survive of the sculptural program at St. Nicholas, the facade was meant to be teeming with fantastic beasts, angels, and even representations of monks or clergy, positioned in the interstices and the joins. It still presents a striking visual display of intricate finial projections and tall innocent windows that immediately evoke the designations of Gothic or French. But the picture is complicated by the tracery within the windows of St. Nicholas, which convincingly is compared to Cologne Cathedral, and specifically to a set of drawings now in Cologne, a similar windows dated to the late 13th or early 14th of the Gothic models available to artists, masons, and architects working in Cyprus during the 14th century. With further scrutiny, however, the facade of St. Nicholas reveals itself as less perforated than the Renaissance style of French or German Gothic architecture to which it's been readily compared. The windows in the second story of the facade are blind, and there's a distinct horizontality emphasized by the balustrade in the second story and the building's overall squat proportions. The interior of the cathedral is even more discordant with Errand reading. There are no slender supports, but large, thick, cylindrical ones. The nave arcade is capped by a horizontal course beneath the large windows. There's no triforium or gallery. The east end terminates in 3 apses without an ambulatory. These that had flourished in the Levant since the early 12th century, and that had been imported to Cyprus by the early 13th century, as evidenced by earlier construction pieces at Santa Sophia. Although distinct from Santa Sophia Nicosia, St. Nicholas in Famagusta also offers a combination of earlier Crusader architectural planning with decorative details indicative of the St. Nicholas in Famagusta epitomized the border between the Western French Latin rulers and the Church on Cyprus and the local Orthodox, primarily Greek-speaking populace. St. Nicholas likely was read by its patrons and the elite Latin aristocracy as a prime example of cutting-edge Western architecture, expressive of Cyprus's new position of Jerusalem and the loss of the Armenian Christian city of Ayas to the Mamluks. Peter I also emphasized the role of his kingdom as the Mediterranean frontier of Latin Christendom by his push for a new crusade. In the early 14th century, Italian commercial groups settled on Cyprus. And in the important port of Famagusta, they were largely fixated on acquiring and maintaining what was granted to them on Cyprus in 1218, 1221, and especially privileges gained in 1232 as the touchstone for later arguments with the ruling powers of the island. In the early 13th century, they were guaranteed jurisdiction over Genoese nationals by Genoese officials, freedom to trade and freedom from commercial taxes, ownership of property on the island, and the king's obligation to defend Genoese subjects and possessions on land and sea. The identification of Genoese subjects is a complicated endeavor. Genoese nationals could be directly from Genoa and its surrounding territories in Italy, or subjects of Genoa and other regions of the Mediterranean, such as the Holy Land or the island of Chios. The so-called white Genoese were people under the protectorate of the Genoese. Those called this in Cyprus were most often of Syrian origin. Large numbers of both Genoese nationals and white Genoese immigrated to Cyprus in the years just before and after the fall of the Latin states in the Holy Land in 1291. Genoa, like other Italian nations, did not initially seem to have a particular quarter or street within the city of Famagusta. A note in 1249, and by the early 14th century, they'd established a loggia close to the Venetian, Pisan, and Catalan representatives near the port and customs house. Although the loggia was not a space for commerce itself, it functioned as a court and gathering space for the leaders of each community. And it was allied with the economic center of each community. The building of the loggia perhaps coincided with the arrival of the new Genoese representative to Famagusta in 1301. It's during this same period that we have the few references through notary documents of churches connected specifically to the Genoese community. In 1301, Gerardo de Santo Andrea left funds for a church or chapel of St. Lawrence, San Lorenzo. St. Lawrence was the patron saint of Genoa, and it is likely that this was to replace lost in Acre in 1291. In 1307, Pietro de Santo Donato bequeathed money for a church of St. George in the loggia of the Genoa in Famagusta. It's difficult to know exactly where the loggia of the Genoese was positioned. There is a church near the port and identified by Ghibellino in his 16th century engraving of Famagusta as St. George's Church of the Latins. While it is unclear if this structure was related to the loggia and its church, it is another example of the architecture being built within Famagusta in the early and middle of the 14th century. St. Francis, in addition, its ruins show a strong affinity with a slightly earlier Franciscan church in Famagusta. and its sculpted ornament is particularly like the treatment on the portals of the cathedrals of Famagusta and Nicosia. This is the detail of the canopy carving from St. George the Latin on the left, and then Nicosia and Famagusta. It's distinguished by its high quality, thus displaying social distinction of its patrons. Does not, however, distinguish the Genoese as a group from the other Latin communities. Instead, it falls right in line with the strongly Renaissance style seen in the rest of the architectural and sculptural programs produced in Famagusta in the early part of the 14th century. Indeed, one of the striking things in Famagusta is the degree to which architectural forms identified by scholarly tradition with one group were adopted by others. Thus, it's often difficult to establish to which religious creed, language, or culture the patrons and builders of surviving churches belonged. One notary document also suggests the fluidity of Genoese patronage towards building projects outside of their own. The will of Pietro di Santo Donato from 1307 left funds both Church of St. George belonging to the Greek community. The Genoese participated in the building boom that flourished in Famagusta in the first half and the middle of the 14th century, contributing their own, often impressive buildings for secular and religious use, and providing funds for the completion of other communities' building programs. The two major cities of Cyprus during the late 13th and early 14th centuries. In Famagusta, it is of note that the emphasis is largely on the built environment, or the architecture and sculpture. Panos Leventis has written on the urban landscape of Famagusta and noted that the role of the city square during this time was primarily for processions and proclamations. I suggest that the public and outward-facing engagement that these architectural structures offer is specific to the context and power of the Lusignan rule and the Latin Church in Cyprus at this time. The artistic production surrounded and provided a foundation for the pageantry and prestige of the island. As the 14th century progressed, the Lusignan continued to rule in Nicosia, and the artistic projects of the Cathedral of Santa Sofia continued. The Lusignan kingdom, however, began a slow decline, along with repeated and devastating invasions occurring under Peter I, who ruled from 1359 to 69, and Peter II from 1369 to 1382. Yet the large public artistic spaces continued to see use in public displays of coronation and memorial. The second half of the 14th century on Cyprus also saw rapid change in the fortunes of its greatest port, Famagusta, due to changing requirements set by the papacy in Rome for trade with Muslims and other groups in the Mediterranean. The tension between the Venetians and the Genoese precipitated a conflict from which the Genoese gained control of two major ports. It changed the direction of artistic production from large architectural and sculptural projects to decorating the recently built structures with wall painting and other signifiers. The Porch of Santa Sofia in Nicosia, which I give you two views of here, was built as the Cypriots changed their sightlines from Syro-Palestinian mainland with its hybrid localized island of Santa Sofia was constructed under the supervision of Archbishop John de Conti. Although never entirely complete, the Archbishop consecrated the cathedral in 1326. The deep rib-vaulted porch with three impressively decorated portals draws heavily, although not entirely, from French models. Each door consists of archivolts, tympana, and splayed jambs, and together they offer a program of Gothic sculpture. Each door has a tympanum, which has arcades, the centers of which have been plastered over. The lintel of each is made up of a series of pointed trilobe arches surmounted by gables with pinnacles between the gables. The flat niches are rather deep on the flanking portals and remarkably shallow, as you can see here on the central door. They also contain projecting metal hooks under a relief sculpture of two hands holding the crown. the flight ornament in the archivolts and around the gem niches. Central portal, which you see here, presents a series of small figures in the archivolts, in each archivolt. Closest to the viewer are the figures of queens on the left side of the archivolt and kings on the right, which you see in the detail here. Next are prophets, and the third order is filled with bishops. The final archivolt is made up of wild rose flowers and elongated leaves. When the portal decoration is more broadly compared to Crusader architecture of the Latin East, it also appears only to have scattered and individual similarities, primarily in the sculpted foliage and capitals and lintels. It appears that while the artists and patrons of this part of the cathedral held on to some influences from the mainland, they more thoroughly embraced elements taken directly from French monuments. The gestures of the archivolt figures and their iconography suggest Gothic influences from the West. Some of these elements point to Rheims Cathedral in the Champagne region of France and carry clear associations with royalty. The sweeping foliage and panels under the tympanum of the central portal at Santa Sofia and in the verso of the west facade closely resemble each other. The verso of France's facade also has figures arranged in niches under trilobed frames, which, although larger, are much like the figures of bishops at Santa Sofia. The symbolic nature of this correspondence is clear. Rheims was the site where the French kings were anointed, and by the 13th century was known as a symbol of the monarch's power. Santa Sofia in the 14th century needed to present a symbol of royal power and the predominantly Western Latin power of the king. Thus, the additional iconographic prominence of the figures of kings, queens, and crowns. With the loss of Acre, the leaders of Cyprus sought to establish their kingdom as the most powerful center of Latin Christendom in the East. Directly confronting the Muslim threat, Cyprus was at the same time so far from Europe that the kings of Cyprus felt compelled to compensate for this literal and figurative. Therefore, in the second half of the 14th century, we see a distillation of Gothic artistic and particularly architectural forms, drawn more directly from 13th and 14th century Western European sources in France, Italy, and Germany. The Cathedral of Nicosia also offers another notion of artistic integration. In this center portal, as mentioned, there are two shallow niches on either side of the jamb, with the remains of hooks that appear under bas-relief sculpture of two hands holding a crown. This suggests that flat panel painting was meant for these spaces, flanking the doors. It's likely that these were Byzantine painted icons. Indeed, while not specific to Santa Sofia, these forms of painted panels are found in other examples from 14th century Nicosia. And this suggests that while choosing Western European forms in architecture and sculpture, the creators of the cathedral simultaneously incorporated works of art associated with the Byzantine Orthodox practice of icon painting. The inclusion of Byzantine images reflects the conciliatory practices of the king and archbishops, as recounted in the interfaith processions of both Archbishop John de Conti and the legate Peter Thomas, as well as the king's support of the local populace when Peter Thomas pushed locals to riot over the treatment of the Greek Orthodox bishops. Much like the spectacles of the 14th century constructed by the king and archbishop, the visual culture projects a kind of fluid and ambiguous border. Perhaps this was a necessary element at the time when the leaders of the island needed to glean support from everyone on the island, as well as those in power in the Western kingdoms. At the same time, the Cathedral of St. Nicholas in Famagusta could be read by locals as a product of market consumption culture and stand for the greatly perforated cultural border that was particular to Famagusta. The cathedral's multicultural audience of merchants, refugees, and local Orthodox and Latin Cypriots may have found the cosmopolitan architectural elements suggested the wealth and grandeur of the city and its leaders, outside of any ethnic, regional, or religious identity the Gothic or Crusader architectural elements might hold. Travelers to the island, such as Ludolf von Suchen of Westphalia, who stopped at Cyprus between 1336 and 1341 during his pilgrimage to the Holy Land, seemed to confirm the overwhelming impression of Famagusta as a wealthy port city. Indeed, one of von Suchen's remarks regarding a wedding procession he saw in Famagusta describes the bride adorned with jewels more precious than all the ornaments of the Queen of France. In addition, it was Famagusta's excess in a different way that was the target of St. Bridget of Sweden's remark to the people of Famagusta from the square in the front of the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. In 1372, she warned of the decadent morals of the city's inhabitants and urged them to change their ways. The cathedral set the stage for her warnings against opulence, The commercial environment of Famagusta suggests that the cathedral cannot be read as a single message of royalty, coronation, or even religion. It also interacted and was implicated in the lavish economic status and power of the city. These connections for patrons, either merchant, monastic, or aristocratic, were important in the second half of the 14th century, when Cyprus's position in the Eastern Mediterranean seemed ever more volatile, given the Pope's revoking of trade embargo with Muslim ports, allowing merchants to bypass Cyprus, the conflict with the Genoese and takeover of Famagusta and other key cities on Cyprus, the absence of King Peter, who was for many years in Europe trying to glean support for his crusade, and the eventual murder of Peter and the riot and coronation of his successor, Peter II. At the end of the 14th century, the Lusignan kingdom of Cyprus was fragmented by its conflict with Genoa. Genoa's relationship with Cyprus and its rulers had changed over the 13th century. The Lusignan government favored the Venetians, and this eventually led the Genoese to fulfill their many earlier threats in the War of 1373. War brought with it devastation to the city of Famagusta and a marked end to the architectural building boom in the early part of the century. By 1374, however, many things settled into a new regime of Genoese rule, which lasted until 1464. And the Genoese involved themselves in the decoration and sculpture of many of the newly completed churches in the city. An important example of the Genoese reuse of a monument is the southern chapel of the double church known as the Twin Churches, to the northwest of the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. The north chapel has been dated to the early part of the 14th century, and the southern chapel is currently dated to the middle part of the century. And thus the architecture was completed before the Genoese occupation. Yet a lintel above the west door and a relief carving upon it has been the subject of some controversy. Both Catherine Otten and Jean Bernard de Veve believe the lintel gives evidence of a Genoese family crest. Otten suggests the lintel shows a shield of the Genoese family Campo Fregoso and was sculpted between 1374 and 1383. She suggests that when Genoa released the hostage Lusignan king, James I, and renegotiated their treaty, the central shield of the Lusignan king was removed from the lintel. De Veve argues the lintel was moved from another building and dates to the 15th century. Perhaps this is true, and we should consider a date of 1447 for the erasure of a Lusignan crest. 1447 is the date that turned the administration of their colony of Famagusta over to the Banco de San Giorgio. In either analysis, it offers a small testimony that the Genoese did proclaim themselves in visual terms, and this included effacing records of earlier powers and replacing them with their own. Larger testimony to the Genoese interest in proclaiming themselves in visual terms is found in a chapel on the south side of the Cathedral of St. Nicholas. It's been examined by Brunhild Imhaus. The interior of the chapel retains fragments of its fresco decoration. Using these frescoes and some sculptural decoration of the capitals in the interior, Imhaus dated the chapel's construction to the early 14th century. She suggested that the function of the chapel was connected to the royal coronation ceremony for the King of Jerusalem. She cites the architectural style drawn from precedents in the Holy Land and symbols of the Kingdom of Jerusalem to determine that the chapel may have been a place for preparation for the king before the ceremony, and therefore retained the symbols and regalia of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The chapel continued to be used during the Genoese period, but with a significant change in function. It was transformed into a funerary chapel. Under the large window was a tomb, now destroyed, for a young Genoese man whose epitaph remains. It tells us he was the son of Riccardo Squazarficus and gives the date 1383. A fresco on the north wall of a horseman, possibly St. George, is distinctly later than the fragments of the early 14th century frescoes in the small chapel, and appear to date from the time of the tomb within the Genoese period. With these additions, Imhaus believes the Genoese attempted to eradicate the memory of the Lusignan. Whatever the motivation, the inclusion of a tomb with fresco painting from the period of 1383 suggests that as the Genoese gained a more solid hold on Famagusta, so too they began to impress their image upon the city's monuments. This may be seen in distinction to earlier Genoese visual expressions, which drew upon and adopted the artistic language of the Lusignan. Here in the late 14th century, the Genoese were appropriating some forms, but markedly transforming them and possibly challenging the visual presence of Lusignan rulership. Outside of this small chapel and its associations with the earlier rival Lusignan rulers, the Genoese community continued to mark their presence in Famagusta by the patronage of funerary plaques and burial spaces. And I apologize, I don't have any reproductions of the specific images I cite, but and hopefully not too confusing, I'm just using these fragments from the Lapidary Museum just kind of as placeholders to give a sense of some of these effigies. Many of these images were placed within the Cathedral of St. Nicholas and removed or broken after the translation of the cathedral into a mosque. One effigy from 1377 shows a young man under a pointed elaborate arch and is inscribed with the name Antonio de L'Olivanto. The L'Olivanto were a Genoese family and are mentioned in later notary documents. Several Genoese declared their interest in being buried in the Franciscan church and often left donations to that end. Christianus of the Genoese family Marino died in 1388 and was buried in the Church of St. Francis. Ugulinus Flisco de Caretto died in 1403 and was buried there, as was Francisco Grillo, probably in the 15th or 16th centuries. While some of the plaques as recorded by Unlar were only fragments of the inscriptions, others retained their figural image. The descriptions of the plaques of L'Olivanto and Grillo are indicative of the type of image presented. The full-length figure appears wearing simple or sometimes more decorative robes, with or without headdress, and often holding his hands in prayer or crossed his chest. The deceased is positioned under a pointed arch, which is flanked by two shields of arms. The inscription format is not exclusive to the Genoese, but the majority of funerary plaques conform to this composition. The Genoese followed the early precedents of the Lusignan and their interest in funerary commemoration and images. The community from Genoa also patronized large. The architectural style and a decorative cross carved into the exterior of the church initially suggested a Maronite dedication. There are a number of Latin inscriptions associated with saints in the western portion of the church, as well as some remaining inscriptions in Latin identifying the Christological scenes present in the saint, and has been lost, as have the shields above the doorways, which he identified as Italian in type, with 3 roses argent and 2 and 1 hearts. The frescoes include a series of standing saints in the west end, to which the laity had access. Some appear to be crowned, and others have the distinctive striated of the Carmelite Church and St. George of the Greeks. The delicacy of the drapery folds and the angels that appear in a Christ in Majesty composition above a tomb niche on the northwest wall, and the intricate architecture behind the narrative scene, possibly an Annunciation, on the upper south wall, suggests extremely fine workmanship and an interest in high quality business of the painting program was identified by Camille Anar. Hoc opus fecit fieri corans tarigos ad honorem sancte anne. Corans tarigos has recently been identified by Catherine Otten as a Genoese citizen living in Famagusta. The painting at St. Anne's was therefore completed by a Genoese patron after the conquest in 1373 and 4. Although the erection of significant buildings has slowed or even halted after the Genoese conquest, the interest in commissioning paintings did not diminish. The Genoese continued the decoration of the churches of Famagusta at a level of quality unmatched earlier. Like the murals preserved in the Dominican Church in the Genoese quarter of Constantinople, today the Arab Jami, or the frescoes in the Cathedral of San Lorenzo in Genoa itself, the wall paintings installed by Genoese in Famagusta reflect an admiration for the highest quality Byzantine painting and were painted by talented Paleologan artists. As in the architecture of St. George of the Latins, So here in the painting of St. Anne, when Genoese patronage becomes visible, it is notable less for its specifically Genoese image than for its appropriation of the highest quality images that were locally available. Michele Bacci's analysis of the murals in the church known today as St. George Exorinos suggests that the white Genoese, as well as the Genoese, flourished art patrons during Genoa's occupation. Noting the Syriac inscriptions, Anlar identified the church as Nestorian and built in the 1360s under the patronage of a wealthy Nestorian merchant. More recently, scholars have associated the church with Syrian Orthodox rite, given the distinct iconography of saints specific to Umbriaco Gibele, a Genoese family who had ruled Jubai, now in modern Lebanon, in a decorative frame. They're seen in a decorative frame around this image of Mary Magdalene and a fragment of the scene of the Merciful Mary. The display of the arms of the Umbriaco Gibele likely points to the patronage to display the arms of their former lords, to underline their status and the privileges that their citizenship allowed them. Bacci has noted that the frescoes date to several distinct periods and are painted in a variety of styles. Initially, the congregation adopted a Syrian manner church. In addition, some of the iconic images of saints show a strongly Italian Gothic style, but this too is filtered through Paleologan painters. Thus, by the Genoese period, not only Genoese, but white Genoese too were choosing to express themselves not in an ethnically differentiated manner, but in a shared manner notable for its high quality and cosmopolitanism. This essentially complicates the study of Genoese art in Famagusta further by signaling the importance of distinguishing among the white Genoese locals under the protectorate of Genoa and those nationals who were Genoese by virtue of living under Genoese rule in another colonial territory like Jubai. The languages of these Genoese could be equally Arabic, Syriac, Latin, or Italian. The religion could be Christian from the Western or many Eastern rites. As the fresco programs from the Church of St. George Exorinos show, artistic choices could proclaim a Genoese presence in specific yet small symbolic ways, such as the coat of arms of a Genoese family, or not at all. Instead, in Famagusta, patron was at liberty to choose from a variety of visual forms, and perhaps most often chose the most powerful and innovative, as in the case of the last phase of frescoes at this church following a clearly Paleologan and even Constantinopolitan trend. The Genoese were also supportive of other religious communities in Famagusta. As mentioned earlier, in the early part of the 14th century, one Genoese patron left funds to a church dedicated to St. George the Greeks, as well as his own community's church of St. George at the Genoese Loggia. This dedication of the Genoese to St. George was also expressed after the riots during Peter II's coronation, when Genoese victims were buried in a church of St. George. Although this church seems not to have been the large Orthodox cathedral of St. George within which they were buried, but another church dedicated to the saint outside the walls of the city to the north. Their burial does reiterate the Genoese community's dedication to the saint. And it's significant to note that the large cathedral church of St. George of the Greeks was built like many of the churches discussed in the middle of the 14th century, but painted in the later decades of the century, and thus in the period of Genoese rule. St. George of the Greeks is meant to rival the Latin cathedral and other grand monuments in the city. In particular, the luxury of the decorations is expressed in the South Apse cycle of the Passion images, like this dramatic kiss of Judas, which you see on the bottom left, which was painted in high quality Paleologan style. The painting of St. George of the Greeks follows the pattern established in this paper of the continuation of artistic production in Famagusta under Genoese rule, and also the admiration and adoption of the highest quality Paleologan art. While it may be impossible to identify Genoese style of art in Cyprus after 1373, there was a clear Genoese period of strong cosmopolitan artistic activity during their rule. Cyprus in the 14th century, like most of Europe and the Mediterranean, felt that upheaval of war, shifting governance and mingling of cultures. Another powerful impact was also felt by the effects of the Black Death. The devastating plague swept through Cyprus in 1348 and again in 1362. The repercussions of the plague on building and other artistic production are areas of scholarly study only just begun. The visual environment expressed in the two most powerful cities of the island mirrors the general upheaval and fluctuation persistent throughout the 14th century. The Lusignan and Genoese patrons of the artistic projects of architecture, sculpture, and painting all sought to visualize their power and prestige. They did this despite the social and political challenges and changes and the cultural or religious boundaries. I hope that the examples we looked at today show that art remains a fluid media of expression during historical periods, even as tumultuous as the 14th century. Thank you.
Nicholas?
Yes, I'm just trying to start the video. Now, well, thank you very much, Justine, for that very thought-provoking and stimulating talk. I think that I should now throw the floor open to the audience, because I'm sure that some members of the audience perhaps have questions, comments, points to raise for discussion. You've made a number of interesting and perhaps even controversial points. So, any questions or comments?